forward to the cloud.
Okay, well, we've got Dr. Graham Pringle as someone who did their PhD alongside a dear friend. It's very important that we get to celebrate what we've all done together. And this project is something I find just for myself deeply inspirational that Graham managed to get this off the ground. Graham, what is your role with the ISSTD? And can you say what ISSTD stands for? Because no one remembers.
Yeah, it's the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, so ISSTD for short. And I'm on the board. I'm just on the board. I don't have it. I've got a couple of committees I'm supposed to chair and things like that, but I'm not one of the high-powered people there. But the ISSTD is probably the only professional association in the world that conducts training and research on complex trauma and dissociation as their focus. Whereas most organisations would be quite a bit broader or looking at stress and not specifically at complex trauma and dissociation. So that's a kind of an important piece to why we've ended up here. Will, do you want me to kick on or?
No, I just wanted to say that one of the things Graham will probably do a better job of telling this story, but one of the things I called Graham after visiting a wilderness therapy program in the United States, one linked with the troubled teen industry, and Graham had to pull over to really understand how wild and harmful and unethical the practices were that I had just observed. And as we kept talking about it, we just became kind of partners in crime in having that motto of the the abuse and harm of a child is the business of everyone that knows about it. So what do we do when we don't call it out? We don't stand up and say what we really think is right. Um, And so the title of this presentation about a dissociative mechanism of change, this became an idea in Graham's PhD thesis, which uh, snaps for Graham. He has recently finished and is now Dr. Graham, which is incredible. Um, but it is something where we took this idea, it was Graham's idea. We invited researchers from the ISSTD, and we invited young people who were harmed in wilderness therapy programs to write these ideas with us. And so that is probably what I think is the coolest part about it, is that the young people are saying, yes, this is what happened. And what I'm really looking forward to listening to is that it is it's not only about the idea of just, is this a bad are these approaches just inherently designed to be harmful? Kind of probably not, but when they go over the edge, they can become very harmful. And that is what I'm looking forward to hearing from Graham. So Graham, take it away.
Cool, thank you, Will. And if you want to do the thing where we all enter our where we are in the world and pay our respects to the ancestors, that's all pretty good. So I'm in Meanjin, Yagara country, which is Brisbane, and acknowledging our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander culture is particularly important when you're thinking about complex trauma and dissociation, because as an entire community, they are suffering from this systemically and have been intergenerationally. So it's of particular relevance for that group of people. And the more that we can know about it, the better. So thanks to the ancestors for looking after the place. The dissociative mechanism of change is actually positioned as one of three different papers that we put in at the one time. And then the journal, the special edition of the journal said, we can't have three, that's taking too many, and asked me to reduce it down to one. So the one that remained is not this. This I took to another journal. But there was here is the split between coercive practice and human rights-based or complex trauma-informed practice. That was one paper. The other one was, here is when we get it wrong. That's the dissociative mechanism paper, which we're about to go through. And the other one is more my research, is what is a complex trauma-informed approach to working with young people. So it was, here's the division, and here's the worst case, and here's sort of the best case that we know of at the moment, as a bit of a comparison. Unfortunately, they only allowed one paper in, and it's not this one. This is at another journal. You can get hold of this, the preprint for this, if you wish. Where is the chat? It was here before. Hang on. So I'll just get that where you can get hold of it, the DOI, if you wish.
Graham, I will also send the preprint link with the resources packet for this presentation.
Oh, okay. In that case, I won't worry about it.
Yeah.
Cool. There's one less thing. So the way I'm going to take you through this bit of a journey is, first of all, we're going to look at dissociation. What is that? We're also going to just briefly mention what critical realism is, which is the research approach I took when looking at this stuff, because it's important to the layout of the article. Then we look at three different levels of reality, or three layers of reality. So the empirical, what we can see, the actual, what we think probably happens, but we can't actually see it, but it stands to reason that that's likely to be going on. And sometimes there can be a split between the empirical and the actual. You know, we think we know what's going on, but it's actually something different. That's the case in this instance. Then we look at the real layer, and that is, what are the entities, the influences on systems and people that cause the actual to happen and the empirical to happen. So we get right down into what are the drivers of people's behavior and belief. And then we'll have a quick look at the analysis at the very end. This is an argumentative paper, which means that it's structured somewhat like lawyers would do. They're quite comfortable with this approach, where they're trying to argue a particular case, a right and a wrong. And so we've structured it in this way, which is a bit unusual for social work papers. They don't tend to be as confrontational as this paper is. So let's get over on the screen. So our basic premise here is that people can mistake dissociation for cognitive dissonance. So I have to explain both of those terms if you're to understand them. They are important, well, they're relevant across all the therapeutic endeavors, particularly in the outdoor field. Then I'm going from outdoor recreation, tourism, backpackers, through outdoor education, through to therapy. And I don't believe there's a huge difference between those things, but I'm covering the full spectrum here. However, when we're talking about, you know, most pronounced case of how we can get this wrong, that lies with the coercive wilderness therapy people in the States. It's not as if they're the only people doing this stuff. It happens across the world, which is disappointing. And I've said previously that I was very uncomfortable about doing this presentation, because I am calling people out for practice, for doing things, and I think they don't realize the level of harm they might be causing, because they're going into it with a good heart, trying to do the right thing. It's just that their belief system has led them to doing some really strange things. And so this paper calls us to look at what is the worst case scenario for getting it wrong. So cognitive dissonance. A bloke called Festinger came up with this in a book in 1957. So it's not new. It's used all over the place. And it's when you've got a belief about how the world works, and you've got, at the same time, you've got experiences that contradict those beliefs. And what you've got to do then is that something's got to change. It's either the belief has got to change, or we've got to dismiss the experience. And so lots of people use this, and I use this myself, in that I might find somebody with a really unhelpful belief about the world. You know, I'm not loved, and the world is always dangerous. That's actually probably quite true for their history, but maybe it's not true now. So what I try and do is come up with examples, just draw their attention to when on a program or a therapeutic endeavor, those things were not true. And I just flag that and say, hey, did you notice that? Don't do too much about it, because we want a few instances of that belief being disproven. And then we can talk to them later. So, this belief you've got that the world, no one loves you and the world is unsafe, but you had this experience in this one and this one. Do you still think this is an accurate representation of the world? What people do when they've had enough of these experiences that disprove, they actually laugh. They have a bit of a chuckle and say, no, that's what I thought before the program or the therapy or the whatever. And now I know it's more involved than that, or it's not always like that. And so it's a much richer story, and it's usually less, it's more helpful because they can discriminate between when that might be true and when it might not. So cognitive dissonance is not new. There's nothing wrong with cognitive dissonance. It's when we force cognitive dissonance as a problem, because if you're being pushed into an experience you don't want to have, you're going to really say, I know this is happening here, but really this is not like my real life. So I'll go along with it here, but as soon as I get home, this isn't going to work for me because this is not real. This is not true to my experience of the world outside of this weird situation. So we know that forced dissonance has a weak effect. Sorry, I have to pause every now and then because I've got to let people in. I can't do two things at one time. So if we're using forced dissonance, we need to have a lot of reinforcement. Incidentally, I'm not suggesting we should force dissonance, but if you're going to use it, it needs lots of reinforcement because it has a very weak effect. And you want it to be representative of what is happening in their normal environment, back at home. So what happens in wilderness therapy, which is very unlike, like all adventure experiences, lean on the fact that they're unlike the normal environment at home, because if it's different, then they can do things differently. And our job is then to transfer that new understanding of the world back to the home environment. So that is always something of a challenge. But if you're forcing it, it's an even bigger challenge because they're just waiting to get home and none of this is going to be relevant. So in coercive wilderness therapy, they tend to send most of their people onto residential treatment centers or boarding schools or those sorts of things. Again, involuntarily, often. And they might stay there for anything from 3 to 9 months as a fairly normal thing. And some people have actually scored up years in these places. So they have an intensive wilderness therapy experience followed by quite a long experience in a boarding type situation, which is more like home, to try and reinforce that understanding. So the wilderness therapy experience tends to be 65 to 90 days, round about that. Quite often 3 months is where they go to for this. So complex trauma is a misunderstood thing by a lot of people. People are getting better. The training is changing, but 10 years ago, people had quite an unhelpful view of complex trauma because they thought it was PTSD on steroids, and it's not. Complex trauma is harm to the sense of a person's self, who they are, how they operate in the world, how they belong and are related with all the things around them. It's a harm to that. And if they don't know who they are and how they interact with the world, they will either be very rigid and not be able to adjust to what's going on around them, or they might be, hang on, I've got to let more people in. Or they might be unable to maintain their own sense of self, and they will just change to whatever is going on in the environment around them. So those two things are quite common for people who don't have a good sense of who they are. So this is a definition on the screen there from the ISSTD, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. And they say complex trauma tends to be experiences that are repeated or ongoing, difficult or impossible to escape from. They involve significant caregivers. They begin in childhood and go through that developmental period and impact how a child is developing that sense of self. And number 5 is they're often covered up, kept secret, or they're denied it didn't happen. So if we're talking, the pedophile rings and things like that, you can understand exactly how those 5 things would work. But that's not coercive wilderness therapy, and that's not adventure therapy. But some of these things happen. So we'll get to a table that compares coercive wilderness therapy and this definition of complex trauma at the end once we've worked through the material a bit more. Incidentally, that's one of our co-authors at the age of 13 on a wilderness therapy expedition, and she's just staring into the distance. She's effectively dissociated. She is not with what's going on around her. Her mind has gone somewhere else because the situation around her is just too awful. And you'll hear from her later on if I can get my technology to work. So dissociation is the worst case of complex trauma. It's the response we have to overwhelming harm to the sense of health itself. It's not about big car accidents and things necessarily. It's about being raised by people who are trying to hurt you or are not actually interested in you at all, and they don't give you any reinforcement about who you are, how you work in the world, what your worth is, how you're related. You're just ignored or punished for being noticed. And that can be as likely to put you into a dissociative state as an adult, as a sort of semi-permanent thing, as an adult, as can the childhood sexual assaults and those sorts of things. So good research has come out of University of Sunshine of Southern Cross. Mary Ann Kate has been doing that to draw attention to the lack of event can be as harmful to the sense of self as the big horrible events. So dissociation is when a person disconnects their awareness from experience, from what's happening around them. It could be that they lose or don't have appropriate feelings for what's going on around them. They may not feel it in their body, so sensations might be different, or they might actually have their personality may not be stable, and it might turn. We all know phrases like "I was in two minds," or "he was beside himself." These sorts of things. They're all in the popular language. We know that people can be, their mind can be doing one thing and another thing, and their body can be doing potentially a third thing. This is not unusual. If you've driven a car anywhere and got to your destination and can't remember the last 10 kilometers, you've dissociated. If you've read a book and then you lose track of what the last page was, but you know you read it, you dissociated because your brain went somewhere else or your mind went somewhere else. When it's a problem is when you don't have control over those things. And you have things like amnesia, can't remember chunks of your life. It might be minutes, it might be years. You can't feel your body. So self-harming, one of the theories around that is you're just trying to feel something because you don't feel connected to your body. It might be that you find yourself in strange places and people are calling you by names that you don't generally go by because there's another part of you has been operating in that part of the world and has a different relationship than the one you have. So the idea of the multiple personality thing, we now call it dissociative identity. Now, children, even more than adults, can dissociate when they're overwhelmed by fear or pain and can't escape. It's because they're little and they haven't got a developed sense of self yet. It's still developing. And so they are particularly fragile, which is why we've got a Human Rights Convention for the Rights of the Child, is because they need extra protection more than what adults require to be safe in the world. And in the end, dissociation is an escape of the mind when no other escape is possible. So if we think about the unfortunate situation of people being assaulted, they'll quite often not remember it from inside their body. It might be that they have the memory, but they're far away, looking down on it from hovering above or something, because it was too horrible to be in the body which was being hurt. And so our mind has got this lovely thing where it can go away and take away the pain. Not the whole experience, but we can take away elements of it and keep the person somewhat sane in the world because they don't feel all of the horrible things that are being done to and around them. So this is a really important thing for where we're going. So on my premise in looking at the ISSTD's work and that definition of complex trauma, and then looking at what Will was describing as complex, as wilderness therapy, the coercive model of wilderness therapy, because there is wilderness therapy over there, isn't coercive at all. But the coercive, systemic, troubled teen industry type of wilderness therapy has got some uncomfortable similarities with complex trauma and dissociation. So we've talked about cognitive dissonance, separating from the escapable. Both cognitive dissonance and dissociation can cause sudden, dramatic, noticeable behavior change. This is often held by people saying, oh, look, suddenly this person's doing all the good things. They're doing all the things we'd want for them. They're having a great time. Now that I know all about this, when I see someone suddenly change, I get very concerned. Did they change willingly? Why did they change? Is this a robust change, or is this just that we're looking at a side of them that we don't we haven't been looking at before? And is that, how do we help that become a more singular sense of self? So sudden change is noticeable, but it's not always a good thing. So the difference between dissociation and cognitive dissonance is where we've got threat and fear being used to cause change, or we've got choice and control being used to cause change. And you can guess which of those goes with cognitive dissonance and which one goes with dissociation. I don't think you need to be told. Incidentally, I can see the chat bar, so if you want to ask things, by all means. The empirical evidence. This is, empirical means what we can see. So what we can see and we can measure, and it's in front of us, and there's basically we think we understand what it is. So in the literature, things have been written by people who are telling us how to do this coercive version of therapy. And if you look there, it says professionals structure risk in a manner that causes participants to perceive the risk as being enormously high. It's a strange thing to say, isn't it? We want them to feel enormously highly at risk. Not much choice and control in that. Now, that was in 1997. Things back then were, there was a lot of the patriarchy and neoliberalism happening in the world largely. Then we go forward 20 years, the same statement in the third edition of that same book. So the authors there are still convinced that enormously high levels of threat are really good at causing people to change. And they're true. That's absolutely correct. But it's harmful change because the person doesn't want to do that, to make the change necessarily. And even last year, they're still talking about dissonance, cognitive dissonance, adaptive dissonance, and they're going back to Festinger, 1957, and talking about fear response to perceived risks. If a child is scared because they perceive something to be risky, they are at risk. The perceived bit doesn't matter because they are feeling all of the threat that they think is in the world. So to me, there is no perceived risk. There is just risk. And they want young people to have this terribly uncomfortable feeling. You remember I talked the discomfort between this is my belief about the world and this is what is actually going on for me and this doesn't equal that. So that's a little bit uncomfortable, but they want terribly uncomfortable. They're really taking this to the nth degree, which is questionable in of itself. And at the end, I'll be okay, but I'm going to die. Now that's a pretty enormous thing for to influence a young person. I am going to die. If that's how we're causing them to change, I think we're not really being very humane. So we have here, L.J. Mitchell was one of the people who started wilderness therapy. He came out of was a Brigham Young University way back when, in like the 70s or so, 60s, 70s. And he started, worked with a few people from Brigham Young, and that's a Seventh-day Adventist, I think, University, Mormon. And they had a survival course going. And so a lot of people who did that survival course then went over and started thinking, how can we use this survival course, which got college dropouts to smarten up and go back to school and tackle their studies? How can we use that experience for young people who are violating social norms at home? And that's where it all started from, apparently, according to some descriptions. You see there the Stories of the Field is a podcast. It's got 200 or more episodes. I've listened to a lot of them. And this is one. And we've got here a quote. You've got two people talking. I'll just press that thing there, and hopefully that'll work and you can all hear. Could somebody just type a yes in the chat if you can hear it? Otherwise, I'll just be standing here thinking I'm smart.
That a lot of what happens in wilderness therapy is you're taking urban kids and putting them in a very threatening environment.
Disorienting.
It's disorienting, and they feel threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the magic, is because of that threat, they bond with the instructors and the people who are there.
Because they're scared. When they're threatened.
Where do you turn?
Yeah.
There is nowhere else. It's part of the isolation.
The wilderness therapy tends to be well away from roads and other access points to get back into the world. They're isolated. When people go to get delivered to wilderness therapy, Will's very focused on the involuntary transport, so being taken there against the will. I'm focused on the involuntary treatment, what happens from when they arrive to when they leave. And they arriving at wilderness therapy is really typical to be strip searched, potentially cavity searched, to be issued a uniform that may or may not fit, to go through a few psychometric tests, to be blindfolded. You got to ask to get toothpaste, perhaps. It's really strange, arbitrary rules. They'll blindfold you to get in the vehicle to be driven out, so you don't know how to get back. But you think about driving through bush tracks, blindfolded, you're bouncing around the place, you don't know where you're going, people won't really tell you anything. Pretty scary when you're 13, like our co-author was in that photograph before. So it's scary, and that's what they're alluding to here. The threatening environment causes young people to change. And later on, the key person there says that he could time it almost to the day when the significant change would happen. Again, a significant sudden change might be cognitive dissonance, could be dissociation. And there's no real way of knowing which of those two it is unless you're really being very careful and with the person who's going through this experience so that they know that they have choice and control. But that's certainly not what they're doing here. So the chances are that where they think they're getting a cognitive dissonance sudden change, they might be getting a dissociative sudden change, and they won't know the difference. So the use of threat is the big deal here, really concerning. High levels of emotional risk are encouraged. It's the perceived physical risk that is the cornerstone of adventure therapy, not just wilderness therapy, but adventure therapy broadly. Everybody should be doing this. This is what I was trained to do when I did my outdoor education training in 99, 2000. We were told to do this. Perceived risk was the mechanism that got people to change. Now, that view has started, the first reference I can find is 93 in an edited book by Michael Gass. It's gone through, I've got all the statements where that same thing is said all the way through to the last one, 2003, Simon Priest has written about it again. They genuinely think that if we put this enormously high perceived risk there, young people will make changes and choices about their behavior. It makes some sense if you don't think that it could also be harmful. So if you don't have this idea of a sense of self, you don't understand dissociation and complex trauma in the way that I've presented it and the ISSTD runs it, you probably wouldn't realize that the harm that you're potentially causing. So the actual evidence, what we can't see, but is probably going on, we think. So Festinger knew that forced dissonance could be a problem. I think I'm stretching things a little bit here. There's this quote. Incidentally, he wrote about 35, 40 pages about how poor forced cognitive dissonance was in the book. So there's quite a lot of work saying, this forcing people to change is not really very effective. And he said there, if reward was promised for compliance or if punishment was threatened for non-compliance, at least some persons would exhibit forced compliance. They'd show forced compliance. Exhibit, not just do things, but they'd actually show that they're forcefully, they're complying because of the force that's been put on them, and hence suffer dissonance. Now, back in the day, I don't think they were talking about dissociation. I don't even think at that time they were talking about multiple personality disorder. To me, he's saying there that if we force cognitive dissonance upon people and we make them comply or punish them if they don't, they may well dissociate. I think that's what he meant, but the words aren't actually there. But I suspect that's where he was leaning because he was not an advocate for forced dissonance at all. Early wilderness therapy owners knew that they were causing dissociation. Now, that same recording that we heard before, in a different part, he says, in my mind, the change has a lot to do with these different parts of self. Remember, we talked about the sense of self at the beginning. Different parts of self, and the part that wants to use drugs, he was concentrating on that, goes to sleep for the duration of the program, which means that we can now work on the part that remains because we've forced dissociation to happen and we've got a more compliant part here. And if we reinforce that, it might be more likely to stay in charge after the 3 months of wilderness therapy and the 3 to 9 months of residential treatment, 2 years of treatment. That part of them, as he's described it, that's compliant may actually last and drive behavior for some years after they leave that program or those series of programs. And the host there, Will White, has done a fantastic job recording all this. I have no no animosity towards Will at all. I think Will White done an excellent job, and he's quite willing to discuss these things and alternative perspectives. In some models right now, he refers to the internal family systems, where we talk about parts of self. It's sort of related to dissociation. It wasn't actually built for that, but many people do use it when helping people with dissociative disconnections from the world. So at least L.J. Mitchell knew that, it seems to have, from what his own statement is there in 2019, he knew that there were parts involved, and they were deliberately suppressing some parts and promoting others. Paris Hilton's done a documentary, The Real Story of Paris Hilton, came out in 2020. That's the link there. And when she started this, it was just going to be about her struggles. And the director kept on asking her questions about what it was like for her when she was a teen. And Paris had effectively forgotten about, she'd put it out of her mind. She wasn't wanting to think about her teenage years. And as she started responding to the director and developing this documentary, she started remembering things that had happened to her. And to her credit, she continued with this process and realized that the documentary wasn't about her. It was about coercive control in the troubled teen industry in the United States. And that because she had a profile and she has money to put behind it, she was able to carry a message. She actually goes to lots of 52 states, and there's a federal system. So she's often in, we would call them parliaments. What do they call them? Capitol buildings, whatever. She's often talking to the members of parliament, what they call them, lawmakers, I think, over there. She's often advocating for laws to be changed so that people can't be involuntarily taken away and sent to these places, but also so that their treatment while they're in a some sort of collective institution has got to be human rights based, effectively. So at that particular timestamp there, you can see 1 hour, 22 minutes and 39 seconds into the documentary, she meets a friend from her experience who said, yes, it's quite common for people to wake up after 15 to 20 years after their TTI experience and start to remember it and start to feel like things were not okay. And maybe it hasn't served them very well. So it's a very effective system. We put them in 3 months of coercive wilderness therapy and then 3 to 9 months of residential treatment. We've got an effect that lasts quite commonly 15 to 20 years. That's startling, but cruel, in that they're not living their own life. They're living a life for 15 to 20 years that was determined for them by somebody else. They had no choice and control. Incidentally, when Paris was in she was in, I believe, 2 wilderness therapy and 2 residential treatment centers. Over time, she escaped from 1 wilderness therapy center. Well done, Paris. But she was also effectively sexually assaulted many times by staff at night doing gynecological exams. And so were her friends. This was not really a remarkable thing at the time. But looking back on it, she's like, I now know what they were doing, because I was only 14 at the time. Looking back on it as a 35-year-old woman, she's going, what on earth were they doing? And this is quite common for survivors of the TTI, they prefer to call themselves survivors, to have these epiphanies in their 30s and 40s. So the real evidence. What do we think of the mechanisms underneath that's causing the actual reality for people to not quite be all fun and games and roses as the empirical evidence kind of led us to believe? So here we've got a book. This is the 1993 edited book by Michael Gass. And a bloke called Nadler has come up with a couple of diagrams. Just have a look at some of the words that are highlighted. Breaking through, breakthrough comes through in several parts. Unfamiliar stuff, dissonance, disequilibrium, anxiety, perception of risk. They're really dancing around the forcing a new reality upon people. This is not gentle. This is not what I would think is humane. This is really deliberate, forced change upon people. And then they break through to success, become compliant, potentially for the next 15 to 20 years. I don't think that's actually healthy change. But to someone who's expecting that, is thinking compliance means great, it's all worked really well, the chances are they will see that as success, and all the hard work of forcing this changed experience upon people and the risk around enormously high perceived risk, etc., it's all worth it, because in the end, we've got a person who fits back into society comfortably and then they're not upsetting the world. But all the same, it's very forced and doesn't allow people to have that sense of control and dignity, which is all part of human rights. So next slide. So adventure therapy academics in the 1990s, they knew about the hazards of dissociation being caused by adventure therapy, AT. And we've got a few there. So Denise Mitten was particularly onto this. For a person who's been sexually abused, an outdoor wilderness situation can make them feel out of their element. And that's a way, I think, of describing dissociative. It can trigger feelings of fear, being out of control, invaded. They're not good. Later, she says women might have to tune the pain out of their bodies. That's a dissociation. To discount how they're feeling and to act as if everything's fine. And she says that's known as dissociating or disconnecting from the experience. So we knew this back in, 93, 94, that these were hazards that could come from any therapeutic endeavor that forces people to change when they don't have choice and control. And down there in the bottom, in the same edited book that that previous diagram is from, someone by the name of Webb said quite clearly, dissociation may also occur when survivors are confronted by the fear and anxiety that may accompany adventure activities. So the people who are telling us that, writing those textbooks over that 30-year period saying enormously high threat is a really good way to get people to change, were one of them was the editor of a book that had in it, don't do these things, or this can be harmful. And it seems like, although they probably should have known, they may not have been paying attention to the warnings from these academics back in the early 90s. And this whole thing might have been avoided, but I think they've got a belief about how change happens in the world, etc., which is that other paper. So the current experts in today's times know that children may use dissociation to disconnect from and block out what is happening to them. It's really children who have little agency anyway, because they're children. Quite often, if you can't escape from the sense of threat that's around you, you've got something left. You can escape with your mind. Your body remains, your mind goes away. And you don't have to suffer the pain, the threat, the worry, the anxiety that is present in your physical existence. So we know that. And that's from fact sheets from the ISSTD, and you can download them there. This is the fact sheet for caregivers. There is another one for teachers, and I'd recommend that one is particularly good for outdoor practitioners to read and think, well, to what extent might be my practice might be causing some dissociative response by the young people around me? Because it lists over several pages the sorts of things that teachers would see in a classroom, and we might see in a social work practice or an adventure therapy practice. And then the next one down, Marianne Kate from an excellent article. Dissociation is likely when the individual has a chronic sense of feeling unsafe, which may be due to unpredictable parental behavior or caregivers, feeling powerless, having no control over one's life, experiencing unfairness, living in an environment of secrecy and being isolated from the outside world, often in an attempt to hide the dysfunction that exists behind the closed doors. I don't think that last bit necessarily applies to the coercive wilderness therapy system. I don't think that's what, I think they're using nature and isolation to keep people contained. They're not trying to necessarily keep it secret, although there is a lot of stuff which we'll get to later. But all those other things, that's Mary and Kate saying that dissociation is likely to be caused by the very things that back in the actual empirical, or in the empirical anyway, evidence, we were being told was great ways to cause change, therapeutic change for a person. So we've got completely different views on forcing people to change happening in the literature. And it's because I was looking both ways, I couldn't get those two things to even out. The adventure therapy literature from this side of the woods and that complex trauma literature from the ISSTD were clearly in conflict. Incidentally, there's lots of people in the adventure therapy world wouldn't do any of these things. And there's lots of people in the complex trauma world who think it's all about biomedical problems and big, horrible events They don't have this concept of a sense of self because they're thinking more PTSD out of the diagnostic system. So the critical analysis, now that we've looked at the empirical, the actual, and the real evidence. Here's a comparison. Coercive wilderness therapy, 65 to 90 days. Dissociation, repeated or ongoing. Coercive wilderness therapy, cannot run away. Over the other side, difficult or impossible to escape from. The staff, I've used the word jailers, but I was trying to put a complicated thing into a small number of words. It's not a very fair description, but the staff are keeping them in the woods or the isolated places, and will track them down if they run away and bring them back. So it's sort of right, but it's a harsh term. And on the other side, it occurs within a personal relationship. The caregivers are involved in the threat and the harm. Wilderness therapy tends to be 19 to 17 years of age. Different organisations specialise in different things. And on the other side, begin in childhood so that it affects the child's development. In wilderness therapy, complaints are dismissed. Parents are told children will lie, and that's actually a thing. We've got quite a number of quotes in the article to show different coercive wilderness therapy organisations and practitioners explaining how the complaints by past participants are rare and unusual and shouldn't be listened to. And over on the complex, the dissociation side, we've got the experiences will be covered up, kept secret, or denied. On the left, we've got poor hygiene and enormous fear. What I found is that sometimes, because they're not able to shower regularly and not get good changes of clothes, and they can be working really hard, sometimes in very humid environments, many times people are describing their childhood wilderness therapy experience, and women are talking about how they had UTIs. This is not every woman, but it's fairly common and well known amongst them. And enormous fear. I just found out 2 days ago, somebody was at not a wilderness therapy program, at one of the other residential treatments in the TTI, and she was acting up in their eyes. They removed clothing privileges from her. Effectively, they stripped her naked and kept her in a cell for a period of time because they said, you get clothing when you behave. It's a privilege to have clothing. No, that is a human right to have clothing. It's not a privilege. You cannot, that's illogical. And not all people involved in wilderness therapy are looking at it this way, but there does tend to be a system that supports some of those things. What I think happens is there's no stop sign to say, hey, this is not okay. Our coercion has gone just a little bit too far now. I think we might be harmful. That stop sign is not there. So total control. There are times on wilderness therapy programs where no one's allowed to talk, where they wrap kids up in tarps so they can't escape during the night. And Will told me about how some young people are ghosted. So if they're really non-compliant, everyone just pretends they're not there and just ignores them. And when that kid's in your face talking to you, you just pretend that you see straight through them. And Will participated in some of that back in the States before he understood what was actually potentially going on. So that's forms of control that are pretty extreme. And dismissing, because they quite often, the things that are happening are not admitted. The people in wilderness therapy, the coercive type of wilderness therapy, are often telling us how the participants are just disgruntled. And they're just complaining, and most people have a great time, and why should we be listening to those few people? So you can see that between the two, we have some pretty stark comparisons. And again, I'm doing everything very generally. So I'm not saying that every single wilderness therapy organisation or TTI program is operating exactly like that, but there is a theme where those things are fairly common. And from a dissociative point of view, we know those other things are common. This is one of our other authors. She drew this picture and wrote that description of what things were like for her at the end of their wilderness and trouble teen residential treatment stay. And she talks about dissociation caused by a wilderness program. It incorporates the drawing incorporates the dissociation of the abusive event, as well as the pain and progressive psychological collapse that it caused over the following year once she left. And she talks about imitating inhumanity and the impenetrability of the figure that is in the drawing to the world around them. So if you look at she wanted to be a biologist, and now she's afraid of going into the woods. This is not choice and control. This person's life has been fundamentally altered because of that experience. And then we get to, so more of the analysis. There's a couple of pages of different professions that are involved sometimes in these TTI programs, these troubled teen industry programs. So I've got here the Psychiatric Association, Psychological Association, Social Workers, and Clinical Social Work Association. Just some of the ethical statements they've got there about what they should be doing as a practitioner. If they're licensed, or as they say over there, we should be working with compassion and respect for human dignity and rights. Clearly, some of those things are not happening. Strive to benefit those with whom they work and take care to do no harm. So I think they don't realize that really coercive cognitive dissonance can be harmful. This paper now says it could well be, and so do no harm means you really do need to stop. Respect the dignity and worth of all people, the rights of individuals, the right to self-determination, choice and control. That comes up again. The next, respect the inherent dignity and worth of the person, to promote, restore, maintain, enhance the well-being of those whom social workers help. So it's about fostering that sense of self, that connection to the world, not suppressing it, splitting it, and concentrating on one part, as we heard that practitioner talking about before. The last one, safeguard the interests and concerns of the client, so act in their protection, and individual self-determination and do no harm. Again, not provide treatment interventions that may conflict with any of those values. So if they're going to do that comparison of the previous slide back there, ethically, these clinicians in the States really do need to have a good think about, are they conforming to their own ethical guidelines? Because these things are possible, not going to happen in every case, but if you don't know when it's going to happen, because you've got no way of telling whether it's cognitive dissonance or dissociation, you've got to go with the do no harm and desist from those practices. That's my belief, if I was over there and governed by those ethics. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. And what I want to emphasize now is we've been looking at this particular case of the coercive version, the systemic coercive version of wilderness therapy that leads on to these residential treatment programs, mostly broadly described as the troubled teen industry. I know organisations within an hour's drive of my home in Australia that have a bit of that happening. Nowhere near to the same extent, it's not as systematic, but what it is we still think, oh, if that person would only do the abseil rappel, they will feel so much more empowered when they get to the bottom. And the young person saying no, or giving you the physical, their body's sort of cringing back from it, they might be crying. And I used to do this myself, and I see practitioners still, just take one more step, just put the helmet on, just come over here and look over the edge, and really urging them to go over the edge instead of saying your choice and control, no means no, we stop now. And so we have this stuff happening everywhere that people do risky things outdoors, because we've got a belief that doing the risky thing is what's going to help build that sense of self. But the ISSTD and our understanding of dissociation and complex trauma is that that's probably going to damage the sense of self. You might get compliance, but you're not going to get an enriched, integrated sense of self from practicing in that way. So about 10 years ago, I stopped coercing people to do the abseil or the rappel if you're from the States. I reckon I've had just as many people abseil, perhaps more, as when I was trying to make them go over the edge. But the one thing is, I haven't had to do a rescue in 10 years once they've got over the edge, because they have choice and control. They can stop at any time. In fact, if I see them not responding to me, I will say, I think we need to stop, because I don't think you're able to tell me that you need to stop right now. Can I check? Are you okay? Do you want to keep going? It's okay to back out. No loss of dignity for that. That would be a sensible thing to do. By doing that, people are enjoying the experience a whole lot more. And I think it helps build that. As I said again, no means no. A lived experience of that, I think, is particularly important. So the cognitive dissonance thing, there's nothing wrong with it. People use it everywhere. But once you start forcing it, you take out choice and control and you replace it with threat and coercion, you're on a slippery slope to doing some very bizarre things in the interest of therapy. What's also, I think, in this paper is the current case of Trails, Carolina in the United States, where I think a 12-year-old boy was burritoed, but in a bivy bag, zipped in, and the poor kid suffocated to death. And the coroner has said it was the organization that has done this. They are responsible for this, this boy's death. How did they get to that point? Where were the stop signs to say, maybe this is getting a bit risky? And I think the stop sign is choice and control. If we think we're being coercive, we should be asking, are you okay to do this? You know you can stop at any time. This is what we're about to do. Do you really want to do that? Most of the time kids will, because they like adventure. But if we're not doing that, if we're forcing them to change by enormous perceived risk, which the textbooks were telling us for the last 30 years, I think we've got a slippery slope that ends up in people being significantly harmed. I will now stop the share. And if you want to come on the screen and say hello, ask any questions, I'm up for a chat.
Graham, with the political change that we're about to have in Queensland, one side of politics is very into the youth crime element, and I fear that if they get government, they'll feel like they have a mandate to do something about it. Do you think they would increase those coercive control type of programs?
Probably. I think some of the things that they're describing are not necessarily hugely coercive, but they are taking them away to a bush camp. And some of that could be really good. It could be connecting to culture and things like that. So I think there's an element of hope there. But again, the slippery slope. Once you start forcing people, where does it end? And we know forcing kids to change is really ineffective. But I suspect that they will if there's no dissenting voice. So I'm hoping to get these articles out so that we can say that they're somehow peer-reviewed and evidenced.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from the floor? I can see David, I can see you on screen. I can see you're doing something with your keyboard or something in front of you. If you've got a question, I'll just, while you're figuring that out, I've got this slideshow, but I've got a longer one which has extra bits in there that I'll make available to everybody afterwards, so you can fill in some of the gaps between some of those slides.
Can you hear me there?
I can.
Oh yeah, great. Sorry, I came in late. Just had to finish a program I had here before I could actually dial in. I just caught the tail end of it, and I think you touch on a lot of. I work with the Department for Child Protection in South Australia, little adventure therapy program, and I find it's a real battle of a lot of old school sort of thoughts here of developing resilience through hardship, and I find it really difficult to convince people around us of what you're saying. Of we're not trying to coerce kids into climbing to that top of that mountain. We'll do it if they feel comfortable, and we'll support them to do it when it's their choice. And I just wanted to reflect also on, you touched on abseiling there. I'm actually doing an abseiling session tomorrow, and I attended one of your sessions a few years ago in Adelaide, and talking about Brockes and Wernicke's and when to know, okay, I'm not going to let you go over the edge now. And you'd hit on something that I've just been thinking about yesterday in light of my abseil session tomorrow of like, I haven't had to rescue a kid yet. And like, it's always on the forefront of my mind of that. How do I empower a young person to say yes and make them feel safe, so that I can continue not to, you know what I mean? And remove those barriers to engagement. And I found that's worked really well when I do school groups as well. I do a few gigs here and there with school groups, grade 11 and 12s, taking them climbing with some colleagues. And I've had the young people say to me, wow, I've never heard anyone explain abseiling like that before, because I'm using the tools that you sort of talked about, and trying to approach it from that brain approach. Whereas I see a lot of colleagues who are constantly in mainstream, it's almost, I don't want to say sausage factory, but they're rushing kids through the abseil and not really taking into consider the brain and how those kids are approaching in that moment. So I guess the message from me from hearing you speak today and in the past has been like, this isn't just for young people who are in a trauma background. It's really relevant across broad streams, and it's how do we help people better understand that to better help all young people engage in these kind of activities, I guess. So yeah, it's really valuable takeaways from me listening to your sessions in the past and today again.
Thank you. Yeah, I entirely agree, and I've met a few people who've said this, who run alternative education schools or whatever, and they say, you know what, a trauma-informed educational approach works for mainstream kids. It's not as if they're different; they're just kids. And I think what I realised sort of late in my doctorate was that a human rights-based approach gets you to the same place as a complex trauma-informed approach. Different pathways, but it ends up being someone feels safe, dignified, and they have control over what's going on around them. And so I've actually got a checklist, both a complex trauma-informed checklist, which comes out of my findings of my thesis, and I've got a human rights-based checklist, depending upon which way you want to jump, to have a look at your practice. Just think, oh, am I complying with that? Am I doing that? Just as a self-reflection tool. So that's a Google document. I'll get that put in the notes for this.
Yeah, I remember being at the top of an abseil and a young person had stopped responding to me, and we were still a few meters away, but I just thought, what would Graham do right now? And I just asked them about breakfast, and they're like, we had this huge conversation about breakfast and how they made it, and they just started moving to the edge by themselves, and then because they'd seen and heard me talk about the process with other kids as well. They got down, they had a great time, and they're like, oh, that was fantastic. And I was like, there you go. That made a difference right there.
Yeah. Giving them time to feel the dissociative response to the fear, and then getting Brockers to work so that they start getting that frontal lobe going again, and then they can make a clear decision.
Yeah, it was really powerful.
Yeah. What also works is when you explain, this is how you get out, and this is how you get out of this situation with dignity. You say, thank you, Graham, not doing this abseil. Once they know they can escape, they go, oh, I can escape. Well, I might stay a bit longer. But if you don't let them escape, they'll be pushing to get out of there. So it's almost counterintuitive. If they have an escape route, they're less likely to go. Yeah.
The more we can empower kids to say yes, that's kind of what we try and do. So
yeah.
Really well. So yeah, thanks.
It is hard in that YJ space, though. I understand that. We've had some involvement with the Youth Detention Centre in Brisbane, and I have heard third hand that some of the youth workers in the centre, when exposed to a trauma-informed approach, started actually seeing how it can work inside the normal custodial environment. And quite old youth workers started changing the way they were approaching things and having more success. Now, that's a third-hand explanation, but I've heard it a couple of times. So
yeah,
I think it could work in YJ, despite people's misgivings, and it certainly can work in mainstream. So why don't we just treat people in a human rights-based fashion? It's easier.
Good one.
Any other questions? We've got 2 minutes before I'll shut the cameras down. Looks like a glorious day down there in Adelaide. Clearly, mine is a screensaver. It's fairly overcast up here. All right, if there are no questions for me, then thanks for coming. I hope this is useful. I hope you're not leaving with just the idea that coercive wilderness therapy is bad and that everything else is probably good. I think when we look at the worst case examples that we can find, we understand deeply why they might be doing those things. It gives us information to pull up short ourselves and say, well, actually, I think what I'm doing is a little bit like what I know to be a bad thing. And then we can, in whatever form of therapeutic endeavor we follow, we can go, well, do no harm. Maybe I'll stop. Maybe I'll ask, do they really understand what's going on? Are they okay with this thing? Am I pushing too much? I do a lot of apologizing to young people, and because I think I might have got it wrong. That by itself is empowering, and they're usually pretty good about saying, "Oh no, you're right. I understand. You're giving me choice." So I don't think it hurts, whether you're doing a talk therapy or whether you're doing an outdoor therapy. I think it works the same way. Alrighty, it's 11 o'clock. Thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and I will potentially see you at the next Social Sciences Week thing that Will's got, which is tonight. So have a great day, and I'll catch you at one of these other events. Bye-bye.